Welcome back to another exciting episode of Cyber Defense TV. I'm your host, Gary Malevsky, and the publisher of Cyber Defense Magazine. Sitting in my hot seat today is a very special guest. It's Neil Walker. He is the
Director of Cloud Solutions Architects.
That sounds great. And Neil, you are at a cool company with a cool URL. It's Cloud plus Fort Knox. I'm kidding, but Knox, K-N-O-X. So it's CloudKnox.io. CloudKnox.io.
That's it, Gary.
Neil, tell me, what does CIEM stand for? I'm learning a new acronym every week now.
It's Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management.
Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management. So
Yes.
it's CIEM, Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management. What does that mean?
So when you look at organizations' journey to the cloud, right, they have to contend with these many thousands and thousands of permissions, whether you're a single cloud or you're a multi-cloud environment. All of these permissions, human and non-human, they need these identities, they need permissions, right? Everything needs a permission in the cloud paradigm. So what we've seen is when you look at permissions granted to an identity, right, really no one has a scope or the visibility into what's actually been granted, if it's been utilized over time. What does the activity of those permissions look like? And that's for both human and non-human. So what this space has defined is really the ability to give you the visibility into what your identities are actually utilizing, as well as give you the remediation options to fix those over-permissioned identities and persistently monitor all of your identities over time as well.
So let's step back. In 2019, 2 or 3% of people were working from home. Post-COVID, we're looking at 50% and growing, working from home, maybe permanently. So we see more and more SaaS services popping up. We see all these plugins and things and connectors and Zapiers and this and that. And everybody's trying to use the cloud as their platform instead of the corporate intranet and apps and the internet. So software as a service is taking over the world. That means I need login permissions, credentials to all these different SaaS services. Are there issues such as shadow IT? Are there identity access management issues where you've maybe let go of an employee or you onboarded a new one? What are the issues that we're facing related to how CIEM can help solve these problems and dilemmas?
Yeah. So in short, it's all of the above, right? So from our standpoint, when you look at the infrastructure, when you look at all of the components, the instances, the workloads that actually drive the cloud, they all require permission, right? So all of these SaaS applications, whether they're using serverless functions, virtual machines, databases, storage buckets, those all require permissions, right? So when we look in an organization's environment and you look at the percentage of permissions that are actually being utilized is minimal compared to what's actually been granted to those environments, right? That's the challenge. It's this permissions gap that exists across all organizations where when they're standing up all of this infrastructure, all of this support for all of these cloud-based applications, they really let the permissions of these identities get away from them. So the serverless functions, the virtual machines, the databases, these are all identities that need permission. And when you look at the mass proliferation of tens of thousands of permissions, you really don't have the visibility into what they have, and more importantly, what they're using. So what our goal is to actually provide organizations with an easy to use mechanism to actually look at not what's just been granted to these identities, but actually look at what they've been utilizing and then drive them down a path where they can easily remediate. Why not? If you have the ability to delete a storage bucket or delete a virtual machine and you don't use that permission, why do you have it? Why leave yourself open to those malicious actors or accidental misuse? Have a vehicle, a remediation option at your disposal to be able to create a policy, create a permission set based on actual activity, and then drop whatever's not being utilized. So from our standpoint, that's the challenge, and that's what we're helping organizations address.
Neil, is CloudKnox deployed as an eavesdropper or a proxy server? How are you gathering this data on permissions, and how long does it take to get CloudKnox deployed?
So the deployment's easy, right? From a standpoint of it's quick, it's painless. So what we do is it starts with a collection. So there's two elements to a deployment. It starts with collecting the data, right? We want to know every permission, every identity is utilized over time. So if I were to use AWS as an example, in the context of AWS, we're grabbing all the CloudTrail data, we're grabbing the Access Advisor data, we're grabbing all the resource metadata, the IAM group, user role permissions. We grab all of this data and we send it securely to our SaaS. And we have deployment options as well, and we can talk about some of those, but we send it to our SaaS. That's where we aggregate the data, model it, give you the visibility, the remediation, and those monitoring options within the platform. But the collection itself is in the customer's environment. It starts with the collection using a lot of high-level get describe permissions, right? Not invasive, to be able to collect that data, model it. And then if we want to perform the remediation, that controller that sits inside of the customer environment, if it has the equivalent IAM permissions, to be able to remediate, to create those custom policies, to create those custom roles in the environment, then that's done in the customer's environment, not from outside from a third-party cloud. And that's where we feel very strongly that our platform is that much more secure, because we do have agentless options within the platform, but when we start talking about remediation and actually fixing, making this visibility actionable, you want to have those components, those controllers in your environment, being able to perform those remediation functions, so you're not exposing your access keys or anything else outside of your organization. But to your point, again, two elements: collector, and then the admin console sitting in the CloudKnox SaaS.
That's great. Now, the recent SolarWinds breach, it was interesting because the malware didn't want to execute on machines that did not have Active Directory, a part of Active Directory network permissions. They weren't in a domain, so they ignored it. They wanted access to the keys to the castle, to the domain controller. Everybody's moved AD to the cloud. So 90% of the companies in the world are running probably a very insecure single sign-on system. Do you help deal with those issues as well, or is AD its own little kind of thing?
It's not that AD is its own little thing. From our standpoint, what we do, because remember, we're collecting and modeling the behavior of all of your identities. We know how they behave. We've established a baseline. We've done a look back of their activity. So when we talk about some of the recent breaches, we look at how does that identity behave? We know where it's executing its permissions. We know the IP, the geography. We know the nature of the permissions it executes. We know the volume of the permissions it executes. All of these attributes we've modeled, we know about those. So we provide out-of-the-box alerting, remediation, reporting capabilities, so that when we see an identity acting in an anomalous fashion, we'll be able to flag that immediately, right? Because we established that baseline. We know historically every permission those identities have used, how they've used them, and we can help in those cases because we know when they deviate from that baseline behavior.
What's interesting is ransomware was hitting home computers and desktops and laptops, and now again we've shifted to working in the cloud. I wonder if there are more attacks like that where they're trying to encrypt corporate records in the cloud, and you would probably catch that anomalous behavior.
Absolutely. From our standpoint, once we see any of those permissions being executed, again, they're going to come from an anomalous geography. It's going to be in a volume that is going to set off different flags, from an IP address that sets off different flags. So from an anomalous behavior standpoint, we go beyond just identifying really what I consider our table stakes. We want to be able to provide organizations with visibility into what's over permission. What permissions gap do you have in your environment? That gap between what's been granted, what's been utilized. But because we're modeling all of this behavior and we know every permission, every identity is utilized, we can then give you those out-of-the-box alerting framework to identify some of those potential breaches as well.
Now, can the CloudKnox CIEM system, the CIEM, communicate with my SIEM, SIEM or SIM?
Absolutely. So from our standpoint, we're SIM agnostic in the sense that we're going to give you the visibility, we're going to give you remediation options, but depending on the organization, you can set up your alerting framework, your reporting framework, your remediation framework. You can contain that all within CloudKnox. But if you have other systems downstream, if you have SIMs, SOARs, whatever your orchestration platforms are, and you want to aggregate those and invoke your remediation downstream. You want to ingest your alerts downstream, your reporting data, your syslog, et cetera, then we have those capabilities as well. So we have both native integrations and we have a robust API set, which really allows us to be agnostic across those platforms.
That's great. Neil, is this something just for the big e-commerce players like Amazon? Is this for anyone who's moved to the cloud? Is this for big banks and government agencies? Who needs CloudKnox and how quickly can they get to?
Gary, this really lends itself across vertical and really it's not dependent on where you are in your cloud journey. If you're mature in your journey, your environment's gotten away from you. You'd have no idea how many roles have been left orphaned, how many inactive roles you have in your environment. So yeah, we're gonna provide you with those insights. But folks that are new to the cloud journey, they're gonna wanna know, they're gonna wanna really adhere to those principles of least privilege out of the gate. So when they're developing their applications, they're migrating their applications to the cloud, you need a platform that's going to be consistently monitoring those applications, right-sizing, least privileging those permissions as you migrate from your sandboxes to your pre-prod, to your production environments, right? Making sure that when you do have those production applications migrated to those new applications that have been staged, that they're adhering to those zero trust, least privilege principles when you roll those out. So from our standpoint, we lend ourselves, whether you're new to the cloud journey or you're mature and you've been in the cloud for years.
Does it take a day, a week, a month to really get that report on kind of the normal baseline and then here's the areas where we've got holes, we've got too many permissions on too many apps and too many interactions to clean up? How long does that take to get rolling and get a really good report out and then start remediating?
Yeah, so from a deployment perspective, that collection that I alluded to earlier, that whole configuration collection, that effort's 30, 45 minutes to put the collection in place. If folks want to use automation as code, if they want to use things in AWS like CloudFormation, if they want to build out the permissions manually, they can do that. Typically, it's a 30 to 40-minute effort to actually start a collection, to marry it with a CloudKnox tenant, and to start that collection. Normally, we set the expectation, depending on the size of the environment and the nature of the collection, 24 hours, we'll model the data. So 40 minutes for configuration, we let the configuration sit, we aggregate, we model the data, we start providing those recommendations and reporting, and within 24 hours, the organization's notified, the data is ready, and they'll have those pre-canned reports, recommendations, and remediation options available to them.
And what's the biggest problem you're seeing for those who haven't deployed CloudKnox?
They just don't know. I talked to, over the course of the last couple of years, talked to many organizations, and when you ask them, do you really have a handle on what's been utilized in your environment? Are you effectively provisioning your different identities with a least privilege framework in mind? So folks, they're doing the best they can based on the assumptions that they have at their disposal. They really don't have a means to look at activity and have a granular view into the activity to be able to right-size these permissions. So the challenge really is, when I ask folks, do you have really that visibility into not just over permissioning, what do your privilege escalations look like in your environment? They just don't know, especially the larger environments when you can have dozens, if not hundreds of accounts. They just don't have really a tool set that can, at scale, be able to provide them with that level of visibility into their environment. They just don't know. They're forced to use assumptions when they're provisioning identities, giving them permissions. That's all they really have at their disposal.
And the longer they've been in business in the cloud, and the more apps in the cloud, and the more users in the cloud, the more complexity, the more really open back doors or too many permissions they have no idea they have until they run CloudKnox and figure it out.
No, Gary, and if you look at some of the more recent breaches that have been in the press over the last couple of years, right, whether it's a compromised EC2 instance that got access to a storage bucket to exfiltrate customer data, if you look at some of these recent breaches, if they were adhering to the principles of least privilege, that malicious actor would have that many fewer permissions at their disposal to be able to act on that environment. So if they had this visibility, if these organizations knew that they had the capability out there to persistently keep monitoring that environment, keep right-sizing these permissions. So if you're not utilizing these high-risk delete, download capabilities, get them away from those permissions, refine those, and being able to do that in bulk at scale and do that with our level of persistency is something that I think organizations, if they knew that they had those capabilities, they'd be on board, because it's an exposure they're just not aware of.
Makes a lot of sense. Do you have a proof of value or a demo or to schedule a test run or some way to show a client what they're missing?
Absolutely. So from our standpoint, when we offer organizations, we talk to organizations, we always offer what we refer to as a risk assessment. So in the context of your cloud environment, give me a handful of AWS accounts, Azure subscriptions, GCP projects, just identify some accounts with some interesting data. Let me model it for you. Give me 40 minutes to put that configuration in place. Within 24 hours, I'm going to have a report for you that's going to show you those exposures. I'm going to roll up concisely what those gaps in visibility are, and it speaks volumes. At that point, really, that's where those conversations, those really take off, right? There's no substitute from ingesting the organization's data and being able to show them what their gaps in visibility are specific to their accounts, their subscriptions, their projects.
And you're doing it non-invasively and pretty rapidly as well.
Absolutely. We're not, to give them that visibility, to do that risk assessment, we're not asking for write permissions. We're not going to ask them to do remediation. Some folks, when they see the visibility, they will light up some of the remediation features to test those out. But from a risk assessment standpoint, no, we just want to ingest the data, model it, provide them with recommendations, and give them a very intuitive report that they can socialize inside their organization.
That's great. Neil, is there anything else you'd like to share with our viewers and listeners today that we didn't cover?
I mean, from a use case perspective, I think folks can envision, in anyone that spends time in the cloud, they can envision how that permissions gap really exists in their environment, where do you really have a handle on whether the permissions granted in your environment have been utilized? So what I want to leave folks with is, I've looked at dozens and dozens of organizations. I've looked at their permissions, and what I've seen is it's extremely rare that I ever see more than 5% of permissions granted ever utilized in your environment. So whether folks really think that they have a handle on this, I want to emphasize that please take me up on my offer to really just ingest a subset of that data and showcase for you what some of those gaps in visibility are specific to your environment, and then let me help you remediate those down the road as well. So that's
excellent. Yeah, absolutely. On my show, we've talked about mobile device hygiene, and we've talked about home computer hygiene. We're talking about cloud hygiene. I mean, where the data is stored, let's clean up, tune up, and harden the cloud as hard as we can, maybe make it as tight as CloudKnox or FortKnox.
exactly, Gary. That's it. That's it.
Got it. Neil Walker, you have survived the hot seat. I'm so honored to have you here today. Great conversation. And
Awesome.
Your company, CloudKnox, CLOUD, CloudKnox is KNOX.io, CloudKnox.io. And that's where we're going to send our viewers and listeners.
Awesome. Gary, thanks so much for the time. I appreciate it.
Same here, my pleasure. Then, folks, come back next time for another exciting episode of Cyber Defense TV.
Thanks, Gary.